Thank you for having me. I am delighted to be here. So the subtitle for this presentation is Teaching for Metacognitive Skill Building. What I'm going to talk about, in practice, it ends up feeling kind of like magic in the classroom, but it's not magic. It's something that we can do. It's a skill. It's just metacognition. My name is Christina Grobe, Assistant Professor of Philosophy. I am at Sumter. And I have been geeking out about teaching for metacognition for the past couple of years. A few caveats. So I am in philosophy, so a lot of my examples are going to be somewhat humanities focused. Don't be too bothered by that. This is open to people across the disciplines, so I invite you to think of ways that you can modify what I'm going to be talking about to make it work for your field, your discipline, and your students. If I recall from my practice presentations yesterday, I had about 2 more caveats, but I can't remember what they are now. So I'm just going to get started. So when I was first starting to teach, I noticed something that I'm sure many of you have noticed before too. Students come to class and you're like, great, let's talk about the readings. And they're like, cool, and nothing happens. And they don't have much to say. They don't bring questions. If they do bring questions, they're really specific quiz style questions, the kinds of questions that have only one right answer, or what, say, Rebecca Solnit would refer to as like closed questions as opposed to open questions. When faced with texts or readings that feel too hard for them, they don't tend to want to dig deeper and find ways to engage. They kind of shut down. And they're really good at reporting about what a text says, but not about thinking through its implications or how to synthesize ideas or get beyond that. And I wanted to treat these as job problems and not like sort of moral problems that students have, not character issues. I didn't want to go into, well, students these days, right? So I came at it thinking, well, what can I do to see these as obstacles that I and my students can overcome together? And one of the things that I learned as I started developing the assignment that I'll be describing to you, the preparatory work that I have students do, is that students tended, they reported this after the fact, like once I started doing these, they would say things like, wow, Dr. Grobe, I've never been prepared for class before because I didn't know how. And it was exciting to them. They felt proud of themselves for finally learning how to be prepared for class. They also said things like, I've never read before class before your class. I always found the readings too hard, so what I would do is I'd go to lecture, hear what the professor had to say, and then I would go back and do the reading once I kind of had an idea what's going on. And I found out that was a really common practice that students have. So they were always working behind the syllabus and not in advance of it, which is really hard if what you want to have are discussion-based classes. So the assignment that I'm describing, that I'm going to be explaining to you, works because it helps to get students out of what they consider to be their normal behaviors or what they think is good learning for them. So what I've developed, what is going to be called in this presentation a daily writing assignment, but I'm now calling just a sort of preparatory exercise in the handout that's available to you. It's called Guidelines for Efficient, Effective Writing. It works because it helps students to develop their metacognitive skills. And when I talk about metacognition, I'm talking about practices of thinking that are reflective about thinking in general. So being aware of the kind of thinking that you are doing, or noticing that what you're doing is solving a problem and noticing what you're doing to be able to do so. It also means being able to accurately assess the level of your own learning. So being able to say to yourself, you know what, I didn't understand this thing before, but even without external feedback, I know I understand it better. And that's something that I'm trying to get students to do, right? Teaching for progressive independence, teaching students how to be better judges of their own learning so that they're not so dependent on grades and they feel freer to take safer risks. So this is what the assignment does, and since I figured that out, I've been looking for ways to build in more metacognitive skill building throughout all of the assignments that I have students do. I also explain to students that if you don't know what metacognition is, because I give a student-oriented version of this presentation for students as well, if you don't get what that is, if you listen to me talk and realize, oh geez, I don't have really strong metacognitive skills, well, this makes sense. Much of the kinds of learning they do in high school, or at least before college, is not aimed at higher cognitive skills. And it's not aimed at teaching students how to recognize different cognitive skills. So they've always done fine. We don't tend to fix things that aren't broke. And so students who come to our classes having done fine in previous classes are not usually well motivated to find different ways of learning or to make their learning better, because it's always been okay. And then by the time they get to college, they think of their sense of themselves as learners is often fairly fixed, and they tend to think of themselves as just being the kind of student who is or is not good at X, or they just are the kind of student who relies heavily on procrastination and it's actually a tool for them. And then when you ask them, well, have you tried anything different? They're like, well, no. So they're not very reflective about their own skills, but they also haven't been taught how to do this. So we can build in spaces for students to be metacognitively reflective so that they are better able to notice the cognitive skills they're using, why, and then maybe even to change into different cognitive skills when they notice that it's warranted. And so this also gets into a distinction that is helpful for thinking about what we're doing for our students, right? Learning versus studying. If you explain this just to students, this doesn't often go very well. But this question from Sandra McGuire's book, Teach Students How to Learn, which is super helpful for putting metacognitive practices into the classroom. When she asks students, what would you work harder to do, to get an A on a test or to teach the material? They always say to teach the material, because students recognize that you can get really good grades without understanding a lot. But without other incentives, they're not usually well motivated to do the work to teach the material as long as they can get the A on the class. So they know the right answer. They just don't know why they should choose it when they're just checking off boxes, right, for the classes. So what we have to do then in our classes is to get students to see the difference between learning and studying, and to want to choose learning over studying, or to choose engagement over cramming, or to choose regular preparation as opposed to like the coasting and cramming model as I'm referring it to. That's hard, and getting students on board is really difficult to do. So I designed this assignment, and I call them daily writing assignments because when I teach face-to-face, students are required to bring a physical document to the classroom every single class period. So they never have to wonder, is this a class where I have to bring it or is it not? No, if we have class, you bring it in. And the idea is that it's designed to teach students what it means to prepare for learning in every single class period. It actually has 4 parts, not 3 now. So the very first part is that students have to look up, include a record of some of the things they had to look up to understand the reading. And what I want to do here is to normalize for students that we don't know every single word we read every time we read something. And if we're learning new things, we should be expecting to find new words, new names, new ideas and people. And so if we're not, then we're not learning new stuff. And so everyone has to look things up when they're doing new research or learning something new. I have to look things up. My colleagues have to look things up. And students tend to think, they start out thinking that that's evidence of their own, stupidity, or they're sort of perniciously ignorant or something about because of it, and be like, no, this is just what learning is. So I want to normalize this for students. They're required to bring a minimum of 2 questions for every class period. And the idea is they should not be quiz style questions. They should be open questions, the kinds of questions that lead to further questions and larger discussion. And I tell them, like, look, you're not going to come up with amazing, brilliant questions every single time, but the more questions you ask, the better you're going to get at asking questions. And they start out with this as being the hardest thing that they have to do for the daily writing assignments or for the preparatory work. And by about the midpoint of the semester, it's getting a lot easier. And toward the end of the semester, they're like, questions, I got questions. I got questions on top of questions. And they start reporting that this is easy for them to do. And you know what, Dr. Grove, it's weird. I'm doing it in other classes too. And I'm like, oh, shocker. I had no idea that would happen. So they start getting really good at asking questions. Every class period, they're required to make some sort of connection or reflection on the reading. And by connection, I mean connect something from the reading to literally anything outside the class, something you learned in another class, something that you know from the news, something you know from pop culture or the media or something like that, something from your own experience, anything, right? The idea is to take what's new and connect it to something that's a little bit less new so that you're building those connections and you can remember things better without sitting and memorizing or cramming. And the fourth thing, which isn't on here, is that every single class period, then their best formulation of the main point of the reading. And that came up when I gave this presentation at the American Association of Philosophy Teachers, and they said, well, my students are really bad at seeing the main point of a reading. And I was like, oh, heck, mine are too. So I want them to practice finding the main point, and they do this every single time. And this is the biggest part of their grade, especially in face-to-face classes. Each individual one is worth very little, but altogether, those writing assignments are 30% of their course grade. And I do that because if students do those consistently, they will learn a lot in the class. And all of their other projects, the experiential projects I do, any of the self-assessments are just going to be easier to do because they're not waiting to the last minute to do all the reading. They're doing it all consistently and with deeper reflection, which means they're getting a lot more out of the material. So at this point, I'm going to ask you to do your own daily writing assignment. I've got a very short text. If you hate poetry, I'm really sorry. Actually, I'm not. And so it's going to be a very short poem. If you're familiar with it or you're like a classicist or something, well, pretend you're not. Pretend like you've never seen it before. And I want you to maybe take some notes or at least try to remember anything that you don't know. Like, what would you need to know to look up? Like, the last question here is really helpful. Given this poem that I'm going to be presenting in the next slide, what would help you feel confident if you had to explain the poem to someone else? So things like how to pronounce words or how to pronounce names, those would be great questions. What don't you understand? What connections can you make? So here's the poem, and I'm just going to give you a few minutes. I'll stop talking so you can have the appropriate silence to do the work, and then what I'd like to have happen is for you guys to blow up the chat while I finish the last few slides, and then we can talk about it all together. This is also often a first day of class activity that I do is we do the very first writing assignment in class together with a short poem like this, either handed out as a short handout they can write on and circle words and things like that, or up as a PowerPoint, like it would be like this. And that way, because they're intimidated by this assignment, that way they've seen it in practice. We've done one together in small groups and then talked about it in the small groups and the large group. So they get to feel a lot safer about it. And because I usually use a short poem like this, it's often one they've never seen before. So they're all on a very even playing field in terms of familiarity or unfamiliarity with the text that I choose. Which also helps to minimize their fear that they're going to look like the dumb kid in the class because they've not seen this before. That also tends to help them to feel braver about it. About the pronunciation of the names, that's something that students don't tend to think about on their own, but as soon as I suggest it as something that they might want to do, they're like, yes, please, oh my goodness. They're terrified of mispronouncing names. So that's something that we end up going over. Okay, it's noon, so keep up with the questions. I'm going to stop looking at them and I'm going to keep going. And then we're going to bring it all together at the end. So now I just want to wrap things up a little bit by talking about how the assignment that I've designed, this preparatory assignment, aligns with research on pedagogy and best practices. I also want to talk a little bit more about practical questions about how I do them and how I get students to buy in. So one of the caveats that I just remembered is that I've always taught what would be considered smaller classes. The largest class I've ever taught had about 37 students, which to me feels huge. And some of you teaching, 100+ student large lectures are probably laughing, thinking, oh geez, you think that's huge. And so that might make a daily assignment like this feel very intimidating. What I do with these is I check them in at the end of after the class is over. They're just completion. Either you did them or you didn't. And if they did them, they get full credit. And I just check it in my little roster, and then they get them back the next class period. And I might leave 1 or 2 comments. Usually it's just like a few symbols, like checks and stars next to things that are just like super good. And I try to make sure that every student has gotten at least 1 personalized comment, a short one written on their daily writing assignment at some point. Obviously, I wouldn't be doing any of that right now, given the COVID practices we have to do. But I've got smaller classes, and I've been doing this now for 7 or 8 years, so this is all second nature to me. So it can seem like a lot of work if this is something you're just developing. And like I say, these are heavily incentivized in that overall, these are worth 30% of their course grade. So students can't just sort of swoop in, write a brilliant paper, take a brilliant exam, and do great in my class. If they're not staying on top of the everyday preparation for every class period, they can't do well in my classes. And that gets the buy-in. So when they know that they're very low stakes, all you have to do is complete each of the parts, and that's it. And then we can talk about it. So that helps students to do it. It also maps on nicely to what we know from like Bloom's taxonomy or Ennis's revision of Bloom, things like that. This second evaluating should actually be understanding. I've got a typo in here, I apologize. So just the practice of doing these preparatory assignments helps them with the you probably have seen images of Bloom's taxonomy. It's that triangle where remembering and understanding are at the bottom. But these also help to develop those higher order cognitive skills that they come into college not very strong in. So applying. So when they're doing the connections and the reflections, they're doing a lot of applying and analyzing. With the questions, they're also moving beyond just mere understanding and recollection to applications and evaluations. So it's helping students to grow those higher order cognitive skills, but without the pressure of saying you must develop these higher order cognitive skills when now they feel really intimidated by it. I don't always explain to them that what you're doing right now is analyzing and evaluating, and this is why it's working. Instead, I just have them trust the process, and they report to me how they're doing so much better than they thought they would be able to do, especially in a philosophy class. This also helps to demystify learning for students. So what students get to see is that it's not as though there are like dumb kids and smart kids in a class. There are prepared and underprepared students. And by underprepared, I mean they're not doing the work of preparation, not that they weren't trained beforehand. Like they actually did the reading. That's what I mean by prepared, and they did not actually do the reading. That's what I mean by unprepared. And this helps students to challenge their own ideas about what they just are naturally good or not good at, or where they are in terms of learning. I have maybe had 2 students who have considered philosophy as a major. Most of my students are taking my courses for Gen Ed. Most of them have never taken a philosophy class before, and most of them come into the class terrified of philosophy because it sounds like something that's really hard and for really smart kids. And so we get to say, look, you were wrong about all of this. Anyone can do well as long as you're going to be prepared. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to be the most brilliant student in the class. It doesn't mean you're going to revolutionize the field. It does mean that you can do really strong work. simply by paying attention to the everyday habits of preparing, which means not just having your eyes pass over the text, but doing these different kinds of engagement with the text that help you to get into it in different ways. Since I'm now teaching everything online, I've modified this assignment somewhat. Asking students to do 2 or 3 of these, especially when I'm meeting asynchronously with them, just seemed like putting way too much on students who are already really, really overwhelmed. So instead, we're doing weekly guided reflections, where instead of having them list things they had to look up, the question is, what surprised you the most this week? And these are definitely helping, but they're not quite doing the same work as doing multiple versions of these for smaller stakes throughout the week. And so that's a challenge for me going forward, to see what I can do to make these go even better. And I'm really curious to hear your thoughts about what I could do to modify them better for online learning, or what you're already doing that does some of this stuff just in a very different way. And so now this is the point of our presentation that I'm opening it up to discussion from all of you. So how could we modify this for classes that aren't discussion-based? So I always teach discussion-based classes. That really works for me in my field, but that might not work for every single field, or it might not work for every class period in every field. So how would we modify them? What could we do? Or what different kinds of assignments could we create that help students to work on their metacognitive skills, but without taking away any of the time that we want for discipline-based class time? How might we modify them for large classes or online learning? Another problem is that a lot of low stakes work can feel like busy work to students, and then they don't think it's important, or they resent it. I've had students say that they feel like this is like high school busy work, and I'm like, this is like grad school level preparation that I'm letting you in on. This is like advanced, but they don't see it that way, not least because I make them low stakes so that they can't lose a lot of course credit for taking the risks of trying to sit with readings and understand them. So what can we do to better, to get more buy-in from students on low stakes assignments? That might be another question. So this is my last slide, and so now I want to know, what are you taking from this session? What can you bring to the conversation? I'd love to hear more about your experience of doing the little preparatory reflection on the poem, and I would like to open it up to everyone in the discussion to talk about all of this. So the question is to comment in chat or speak, and I'm open to whatever. That's totally up to whatever. So one of the questions, sort of general, is do I share resources with students on what metacognition is? And that's an awesome question, and I mostly don't. I do a student version of this presentation for our OSP students in the fall. And so I explain a lot of these concepts, and in my philosophy courses, we start with an article that's from Teaching Philosophy on Reading with Metacognition by Dave Concepcion. And so that introduces some of the concepts of metacognition. But otherwise, I mostly just pull them along without explaining it a lot, because otherwise they kind of flip out, or they get themselves psyched about it in ways that make it feel stressful. So I don't do that as much. Yeah. I'm enjoying a lot of the questions about the poem, so I'm just going back to that slide. And I'm curious to know how many of you recognize any of the names and how many of you don't. But in case you're not super up on all of your Greek stories, Peleus and Metanira are both humans, and they're both married to immortals who are doing rituals on their children to make them immortal as well. And I imagine that if you saw, for example, your wife dipping your newborn baby into a river or into fire, you might be terrified and stop the ritual. But the immortal parents are doing this to make their children even more resilient than their human partners. I also teach, first and second year generally. So, early in the career, not later, where there's even higher stake stuff. And I guess you might then be in the position of being able to explain even better to students why it's all of the tiny little things that go into like habit creation that are so important for strong learning, as opposed to high stakes cramming and then you forget stuff. So you might have an opportunity to get deeper into theory about it, I guess. But yeah, that's really hard. Yeah, maybe doing something like this, like instead of sharing a poem, which I do to put students at ease, because they've at least seen poems before. But yeah, like I've also done this workshop style with just chunks of text from the readings we've done. So workshopping a challenging paragraph or two from the texts that you're doing to show them how to engage, not just by, say, highlighting everything, which we know doesn't work, but by finding ways to ask questions in and with the text, having them feel safe to talk about all the things they might have to look up. That might be a way to sell them on doing something like this so that they can prepare better, and to show them why this is actually higher level preparation and not busy work. Yeah, that's a great question. So how to balance helping those who struggle with metacognition to build the skill while encouraging those who demonstrate success to continue at a deeper level. And that's one of the nice things about, say, the template of this assignment is that I get to see a wide range of engagement with it. And so there are some students whose preparatory work is just phenomenal, who have not just 2 questions, but say 4 questions, and they're all amazing. So students are free to take these as in-depth as they want. Sometimes they're making just like fantastic connections, or they look up so much, but then they talk about it, right? So I've noticed that the stronger students automatically do better, and then they keep doing better throughout the class. But the weaker students get at least some help in doing this at all. And so some students will start out and say, oh, I don't have to look up anything. And I'm like, really? That doesn't seem like a thing. Or they come up with 0 questions, or they're all quiz styles. So the weaker students can make more rapid gains because they get a reliable template of what they have to do every single time. And so they get better. And then the stronger students just take it and go nuts with it, and then they get really strong, because what they get to do is they get to automatically do it at deeper levels. So I found that this is a really elastic assignment in that sense, because it's approachable to students no matter where they are, and they can, like, wherever they are, they improve over the course of the semester. And that's one of the things I invite them to do as well, is to look at their daily writing assignments from day 1 and compare them throughout the semester and see how much they've grown.